And then, yeah, basically, I'm going to hand it over now to David Jorm, speaking on managing technical security teams. I'll hand it over to you, Dave.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me all right. It's nice to be here, at least virtually. It's a shame not to be on the Gold Coast by the pool. Unfortunately, I'm in Melbourne, shivering, locked inside my apartment, but hey, it could be worse. So yeah, this presentation is a little bit about my journey in management. So I've been in the security field for close to 20 years in various technology roles, focusing on security over the last 10 years, more and more. And then for the last 8 years or so, I've been managing technical security teams. And in that time, I've learned a bunch of things that work, a bunch of things that don't work, and just wanted to go through some of that learning and talk about some of the things that I've learned and things that can be applied in other teams. So here's a little bit of the history of my management career in the technical security world. And my first management gig was at Red Hat, running part of the product security team. In each of these, I'm going to draw a little mini org chart, and the bit that's red is my role and the people that reported to me in that role. So I joined Red Hat in 2009, working on the documentation team. I just got back from China and was at the Bureau of Meteorology, porting Fortran code from AIX to Red Hat Linux, which is, as you can imagine, about the most boring thing in the world. People are saying no slides. Okay, let's sort that out. There we go. Thank you, everybody, for the feedback. If anyone can let me know they can see the slides now, that would be great. Awesome. And Fortran is boring. Yeah, so I was porting Fortran code from AIX to Red Hat Linux, not having the best time in the world. My friend called me up and said, do you want to come to Brisbane? We're writing the documentation for the kernel virtualization machine. And I said, yeah, that sounds awesome. So I got there, and the manager of the Brisbane engineering operation sat me down, and the first thing he said was, don't think that writing documentation is a backdoor into the engineering organization. If you want to come here and be a developer or an engineer, you have to apply for that. And I thought, I'd never really even thought of that as a path, but thanks for tipping me off. So within like 9 months, I'd moved from documentation into product security. So from 2012 to 2014, I ran part of that product security team. And that was a really interesting role because the team was completely virtualized and remote. So the initial people that I had reporting to me, not one of them was in the same country as me. Eventually, I hired a couple of people in Australia that I knew, but the entire team was geographically distributed. Everything was online. Our team meetings were actually done on IRC. Everyone didn't even want to do a voice call, so we literally had IRC text meetings for team meetings, and that was how I learned to manage a team, which was an interesting experience. After 2014, various things happened at Red Hat that caused a few people to leave, and as happens when a lot of people leave an organization at the same time, often they all wind up at another organization together. So a lot of the ex-Red Hat people wound up at a company called Console Connect, which is a software-defined networking company. It's now part of PCCW based out of Hong Kong. They acquired it. So I was originally just doing security for them, but then I also moved into building the back end of the system, which had a lot of security implications because we were managing people's BGP routes and core internet routing tables and so on. So it was an engineering role, software engineering role, but it was also had a very strong security focus. So I was managing all the DevOps engineers, building the platform, but I was also almost like the CISO for the organization, not quite, but was responsible for all of the engineering security for the organization, had a full-time security engineer reporting to me. This role was office-based in Brisbane and in Silicon Valley. So the team was split pretty much 50-50 between the two, but that was it. It was Brisbane and Santa Clara. And we had a lot of time zone overlap, which was something that we didn't have at Red Hat. We'll talk about time zones more later. But that West Coast US, East Coast Australia time zone overlap kind of worked for us. 2016, I started working for Trustwave and became the practice lead Asia Pacific. So at this point, the role grew to the point where I had about 10 pen testers in Australia reporting to me, plus we had a Singapore team, plus a Manila team that all rolled up into the APAC organization. So this is pretty much a straight up penetration testing consulting organization. We sold, as I say later, we sold pen tests and pen test accessories, and that was about it. But it was managing a large team that had managers underneath me and was geographically distributed. And then for the last 2 years, I've been at Commonwealth Bank, managing part of the security assurance team. And once again, the organizational structure when I got there was very geographically based. So they had a Sydney pen test team, a Melbourne pen test team, and then a Bank West assurance team over in Perth, and everybody reported to a manager based on their geography. That's now changing quite a lot. So as a result of everything that's happened with COVID, we're moving away from office-based work to everybody working from home to quite an extent. At least everybody in Melbourne's been working from home since March and probably will continue to do so till the end of the calendar year. Most people in Sydney and Perth are as well. So that's broken down those geographic organizational structures, and we're starting to get more of a functional structure. We're reorging people based on, well, what part of the business do you look after and what kind of functions do you logically group together and then put management structures there rather than geographically. So I wanted to talk about a series of dichotomies that I see in different approaches to managing technical teams. And in each of these, I'll talk about an example that's come out of the experience that I just mentioned and examine the pros and cons of each side of the dichotomy. So the first one is about how people get into management roles. And I'm putting this one first because this was how I got my gig managing product security. I was one of the product security engineers looking after the Java virtual machine. And my boss put it out to the team that he wanted a manager, that the team had become too big for him to manage, and he needed a manager underneath him to manage a portion of the team. And he put this call out there on one of our IRC meetings, and I called him back and said, hey, Mark, I'm interested in the role. And he said, oh, great, I'm really glad that you called me because you were the one person that I was hoping would respond. And he said, if you didn't respond, I was going to have to get a professional manager because nobody else in the team wanted to do it. And I wasn't really sure what he meant by a professional manager, but this is it. So this was my career path in management, was that I started off as an individual contributor, became a team lead and sort of senior person within a team, and then eventually managed that team. And what that team was doing there was product security. We were coding patches, writing advisories, coding reproducers, triaging stuff off the full disclosure list, et cetera, which was my bread and butter. And so then I was managing people that were doing exactly what I knew how to do. The way that that often expands for people into higher level management positions is that they take that path and then go into a broader function. So I can think of people like my manager and my manager's manager at the bank who have done that, and now they've expanded to an area that's too large to possibly be their own personal technical domain, but it's a superset, rather to say, of their own personal technical domain. But the other path that some people take is really to become a professional manager. And this is where they're managing functions they do not have technical knowledge of, even as some reflection of their own skill set, but they're just applying management as an abstract lens to that function. And that was what my manager at Red Hat was saying: if you don't take on the team, I'm going to have to seek out one of these people because there's nobody else that I can find to do it. And in the end, after I left, that's what they did. They got somebody to replace me who was a professional manager, and there were pros and cons to it. So this is, from my perspective, the pros and cons of these different approaches. The former technical specialists, you have that domain knowledge, you can make technical decisions. No one can hoodwink you into what they're doing. You understand what they're doing. No one can pull any tricks. You get some respect from the team members because you actually have some domain knowledge, and they'll come to you not just with management questions, but with technical questions that relate to your skill set. And it gives you the ability to really mentor junior team members rather than just saying, oh, you should do your OSCP or you should do this or whatever. You can actually give them hands-on skills transfer. And I think that enhances the relationship that you can have with them as a manager. The cons there, as I said, difficulty recruiting. So it does tend to create this path where people become a technical individual contributor, then a senior contributor, and then the only next step is to become the manager of that team. And for a lot of people, they don't want to take that step. They would prefer to stay technical for as long as possible. They're not really interested in management. But it can create that as the only possible path and then force people who aren't necessarily have the aptitude for it into that role. The other thing that I've observed, people who do take that path can have a tendency to excessively micromanage because they do understand everything that's going on. They really want to have their finger in every pie and make sure that the quality is up to scratch, make sure that they're checking people's findings and checking their work technically. And that doesn't scale well and can bother people. We'll get to that as a separate dichotomy in a minute. The professional managers, I mean, they have the ability, because they've got proper training in the field, to manage upwards, you know, deal with things like budgets and business objectives, which most security nerds, we have to figure that out after the fact. Nobody's, you know, I've got the Harvard Business Review book collection on my desk, and I had to just read the books and figure it out because no one ever taught me that stuff. Better ability with soft skills to handle team conflict and so on, because they've got experience and training in that. The real limitations of having a professional manager, they don't actually understand what the team is doing. And therefore the team can often get away with a lot of things that perhaps they shouldn't. They cannot act as a real front for the team and answer technical questions on their behalf. They'll always have to defer technical questions to the team. And it will be difficult to create that one-to-one mentoring relationship with a more junior person because you don't have the technical skills to actually transfer. So the story I wanted to tell here was about Red Hat. So my boss, Mark Cox, was actually one of the original authors of OpenSSL. They originally wrote it to get around the crypto embargo from the US, where they considered cryptography to be a munition and you couldn't export it. So they coded OpenSSL in Brisbane and Edinburgh. He's based in Edinburgh in Scotland. So he was one of the original authors of OpenSSL and was the director of product security at Red Hat. And he gradually got replaced by somebody who came out of, literally had a Harvard MBA. And the way that they approached the team was very different. With Mark, he had that real technical leadership and everybody respected him. And whenever we had OpenSSL vulnerabilities, he would code the patch himself or he'd QA the patch himself. And that created a culture that was deeply technical within the team. Once that got replaced with the MBAs, it meant that, yes, we had better visibility from a business perspective, we were better able to manage budget and all that sort of stuff, but it eroded that technical foundation within the team. That sort of leads into the second dichotomy that I wanted to talk about. And I mentioned it before, with people who have a high technical focus, there can be the tendency to micromanage, and that isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. I mean, being subjective, it's a bad thing. I don't like to micromanage, but objectively, I can see why it can be a good thing. And the pros of micromanagement are that ability to manage upwards, you know, set expectations and meet requirements, because you control everything that's going on the ground to a fine degree. If somebody says you're going to meet this deadline on Friday, because you can pull all the strings, you can say, yes, we're definitely going to meet it on Friday. It can be good for junior team members, and this leads into a broader theme here about the personality of people, and that none of this is a one-size-fits-all. There are quite a lot of people, and particularly in my experience, more junior team members who like to be micromanaged. They like having structure and order and knowing what they're doing each day and knowing that they're working towards a goal with a consistent, well-documented process. The downside of that is the micromanager tends to become a single point of failure. And the ones I've seen that are successful at it become total workaholics, and they're indispensable to the system because everything has to flow through them. The junior team members, from my observation, do seem to like it, but the senior team members often become stifled and think, I don't have enough input into this, I don't have enough autonomy. And that lack of autonomy can make it difficult to defer problem solving because the micromanager will try and solve the problems themselves. Having more of a hands-off approach, which is my personal style, and as I said, I'll get to this later, that I think a lot of this comes down to personality, does empower individuals to do that problem solving. And it tends to scale better. It tends to allow you to hire people at a senior level and then devolve those responsibilities for decision-making, particularly technical decision-making, down to them. There's no, and I didn't mean to be genderist here with No Indispensable Man. It's actually a poem, if you look it up, called No Indispensable Man, written in the 50s. And it just is a nice little literary illustration of the fact that no matter how indispensable a person may be, there is no indispensable person. In the end, Steve Jobs died, and Apple, what's the stock, quadrupled or whatever since he died. So there is no indispensable person, and there never will be. The cons of having that hands-off approach is you can have a lot of divergent processes, because if you allow the senior team members to do things their way often won't be the same as their peers. It might be, that they get two different processes for the same thing. So that can be a problem, and it can be difficult to manage deadlines. And this is something that I'll speak to a little bit later with one of my experience, where this became a big problem, that I was a hands-off person and somebody else that I worked with was micromanager. And this is what the HR person at the time called the anarchist and the general. So this is when I was working at Console Connect and we were building this software-defined networking platform. And my team was responsible for the back end and another development team was responsible for the front end. So we had to have this interlock where the front end would build a UI for a feature and the networking back end would actually implement it on the physical network. And what we found was that the front end was developing at a very consistent pace, because front end web development these days is not really rocket science, right? It's a well-established art. There are ways of doing things. And so long as you've got your process running smoothly, the requirements coming in the top of the funnel, et cetera, you can churn stuff out at a relatively consistent pace. Whereas in the back-end case, we were solving unsolved networking problems. We were trying to route 10 gig per second traffic through a Linux kernel in a virtualized kernel, which it turns out you can't do. You can't scale it above about 1 Gbps in the Linux kernel. So we were dealing with these unsolved engineering problems, but trying to fit into a product development schedule that was rigid. And that had real conflict, because they'd say, well, we're ready to consume your API. Where is it? Where is it? And we didn't have it ready. And this caused a lot of frustration, because I was saying, speak to my developers. They're the ones who are making the decisions. They're the ones who are solving the problems. I don't actually know. Whereas the person who was managing the front-end development team was very much a micromanager, had everything completely under control, and it caused a lot of friction and frustration for both of us. So this is an illustration that comes from a book called Remote Office Not Required. I would highly recommend this book to anybody, particularly in current times. And it's from the people from 37 Signals who built a completely remote company, no office, no nothing, completely virtual. And they were one of the early adopters. This is going back over 5 years ago, before it was really commonplace to do so. And they wrote a book about sort of patterns and anti-patterns for working remotely versus working in offices. And they identified a few things, like, for example, if you build an organization that's completely remote and distributed, like we did at Red Hat, that becomes part of the DNA of the organization, and it becomes embedded in culture and in systems. You have systems like the team meeting is run on IRC, and the team meeting is run at a time that is the least worst for people in 6 different time zones. Whereas in an office, you'll have cultural norms, like the team meeting is a physical scrum at 9:30 a.m. at such and such a person's desk. So they identify these patterns and anti-patterns that do and don't work for remote working. And one of the biggest ones that I wanted to identify, before we get to that, one of the biggest ones that I wanted to identify was hybrid mode. So they talk in there a lot about, if you build a company that has this as the pure mode of operation, it can be quite successful. You can also, of course, build a company that's traditional, bricks and mortar, everybody in a building, everybody in the same time zone, things can be done physically, and that works. It's proven to work. And the hybrid mode is something that I think COVID has forced out of a lot of organizations. It's definitely forced it out of Commonwealth Bank. We were much more a traditional office-based culture when I joined 2 years ago, and now we've been forced to adapt and forced to have people working remotely. But one of the things that they highlight here is that the satellite worker doesn't tend to work particularly well. So if you have like an office core, and then you have a few people who work remotely from home, might be in different places, might be in different time zones, there's a strong tendency for those people to be subtly excluded. Because you might say, all right, the team meeting is in this office and we have a Zoom call with a camera in the office. So yes, those people are included in the meeting, but then everybody goes downstairs for coffee afterwards and has a chat, and they're excluded. So those subtleties tend to make the sort of hub and spoke model, where you have a big hub of people, but some people remote, a little bit of an anti-pattern. And I've seen that borne out in my own experience. I think if you are going to do a distributed team, you need to go all in to an extent with it. But there is one big limitation, and that's time zones. So this graph is world population by time zone. And it's got two really interesting outliers in it from a business perspective. They're obviously India and China, right? You can see they're at 5.5 and 8. If you scrub those out for two reasons. One, from the perspective of the technology industry and a lot of the industries that we work in, China is a highly isolated economy. It has its own technology stack, its own versions of everything, and the extent to which we interact with people from a business perspective is relatively limited, particularly relative to the size of its economy and population. And then India is a developing economy, so from an economic perspective, there is less exposure to that. So then you see the real peaks of where people are, particularly in the English-speaking economy, are at UTC -5 and UTC 1, i.e. the East Coast of the US and Western Europe. And you'll find that for a lot of Western global companies, that's how they're structured. That if you're going to have a time zone overlap, it will be between the East Coast of the USA and the West Coast of Europe, which for us is usually around 11 p.m. to 2 a.m., UTC +10. It's terrible. Hence, I call it the time zone ghetto over here in UTC +10. So when I was at Red Hat, this was a really bad situation. The other thing is people's setup. So this is my desk, by the way, where this is the inverse of where I'm sitting right now. You can see both sides. So I live in a tiny little apartment in Fitzroy in central Melbourne. And I never intended to be working from home for 6 months straight. I bought this apartment because it's 1.5 kilometers to the office. I can walk to get food 200 meters down to Brunswick Street, et cetera, et cetera. I'd opted in for a lifestyle where I'd be based in an office and design my life around that. Whereas people who are going to work remotely often design their life in a different way. They'll buy a big house on the beach in the middle of nowhere because they can, and they'll work different hours, et cetera, et cetera. And the people that self-select for that remote culture tend to be more successful. This was something that we saw very much at Red Hat, that because it was part of the value proposition to the team, you can work from wherever you want, we don't care. You can work on your time zone, it doesn't matter. Then we were able to attract people all over the world, and that was one of the big pros. We could recruit the best skills anywhere in the world with zero property overheads and generally a lower cost. Because if you say we're going to be in Sydney and San Francisco or somewhere, those wages are way higher than the average globally. So we're able to get the best people at a low cost with zero property overheads, et cetera. But it tended to be more successful for the people that had opted in from the get-go and they said, I know what I'm getting into, I've structured my life around this and I'm good with it. It's another anti-pattern born out in that book called Remote, that people who have been thrust into this situation like the ones in COVID, I mean, I'm okay with it personally because I've done it for years before, but I see with a lot of my colleagues, particularly more junior team members, they're all a bit befuddled by the whole thing. They've never dealt with this, they never thought they'd deal with it, and they're struggling to adapt. So if you are going to go with the distributed team culture, I think it's important to get people who've opted into it rather than those who've been thrust into it. And then to deal with the time zone issue, to manage based on domain, manage based on domain and geography. So if you manage purely based on geography, then you will have the limitations that we did at CBA. If you manage purely based on domain, it can work if you're on the same time zone, but with those time zone issues, you really have to deal with it. So it's a different matter if you're a globally distributed organization or one that's just based in Australia or Asia Pacific. I think that being in the time zone ghetto between the US and Europe, Asia Pacific really needs to operate separately. It burned me out. In the end, that was the main reason that I left Red Hat, was all of my meetings were between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. and it just burned me out completely. So a little funny story about remote working and what can go wrong. So we had this thing at Red Hat where we would hire people anywhere in the world. And there was one case where we built this engineering hub in Brno in the Czech Republic. But we had one guy that we wanted to recruit on the product security team who lived in Slovakia next door. And he didn't want to have to go to Brno. He wanted to stay working from home in Slovakia. So we created a legal entity in Slovakia and hired him. He was the only employee of that entity. But at the same time, there was this ongoing push to build an engineering hub in Brno. And they were getting people, this was around the global financial crisis. A lot of the European economies were collapsing. Czechia is in the EU, so they were pulling people from all over the EU into this Brno hub. And they were pulling a lot of people actually out of Slovakia into the hub. And eventually some of them started to find out about this guy who was employed by Red Hat Slovakia, and it caused incredible friction in the company because so many of them said, hey, you can do it. You've got this legal entity. There's this guy who's doing it working from home. Why can't we go back to Slovakia and work from home? But it actually undermined the entire effort to build an engineering hub in Brno and caused a huge amount of friction. The next dichotomy that I wanted to look at in the way that you manage these teams is waterfall versus agile. And I mean, this is a sort of classic diagram about waterfall versus agile. But I think, what does waterfall and agile actually mean to people? It can mean a lot of things. One of them is this shift left mentality, where if you go back to the waterfall definition, you've often got security activities around here, like assurance activities around the testing part, whereas here you can have them built into this whole iterative cycle in agile. And then people say that ability to do things more iteratively means that we can identify security issues earlier on in the cycle, we can fix things earlier, we can save money, et cetera, et cetera. But is that really what Agile is all about? What is the definition of Agile? And so I think it's important to say, to go back, and this is a screenshot from the 1996 whatever webpage, agilemanifesto.org, which is the actual Agile manifesto. And it's just this, and all this stuff about scrums and tribes and Kanban boards and blah, 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 blah. That's all syncretic built on top of it. That's all like post-canon. The actual original canon of the Agile manifesto is just this, that where there are values on the left and the right, we value the ones on the left more. Individuals and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, and responding to change. So these things like responding to change over following a plan is what's resulted in these artifacts of Agile that become more iterative with shorter build cycles, etc. But it was never actually, Agile was never actually set up as a direct opposite of Waterfall. It's just sort of become that over time. But the Agile way of managing a team has a lot of pros, and I'm just going to put it on my sleeve that I am pro-Agile for pretty much anything. For running a pen test team, for running a software engineering team, for running a security assurance team, a product security team, incident response. I think it's the correct way to run it. But of course, there are pros and there are cons. And those pros are that you can integrate very rapidly with any iterative cycle. So at the bank, for example, we do pen tests that are very long projects. And it works, the waterfall model works well there. But we also have very iterative software development teams where for NetBank and the Combat Mobile app, we're pushing out changes every week. And if you have to scope up a pen test and run a traditional pen test every single week, it becomes very difficult. So by having a more agile process, you're able to integrate with that. One of the big things that I do find, though, is a trade-off between waterfall and agile is about schedule predictability. So particularly for longer projects. And I've seen this in the software development world at Console and Red Hat. I've seen it at the bank where we run software deployment projects where we might buy a commercial off-the-shelf product, but it takes 9 months, 2 years to actually roll the thing out into prod. And I've seen it in the consulting world where you'll have people with complex projects with tight, definitions of when you can and cannot test. And for that, waterfall tends to work better, because you can actually schedule things, you can have all your dependencies lined up, you can have your entry criteria and your exit criteria for whatever activity you're executing, and operate with some degree of certainty. Agile becomes difficult because people say, when is that scheduled? And I go, I don't know, when it bubbles to the top of my Kanban board, when it becomes the next most important thing to do in the next sprint. I don't know when that is. So there is that advantage to waterfall, but I think other than future workload predictability, there's a lot of advantages to Agile. The example that I give here is the one that I was talking about at the bank, where the traditional model is we run pen tests like you would at a consultancy. We get something that's happening, a system's going live, we write up a scope, we get the scope approved by the customer, internal customer in this case, we schedule a testing window, we execute the test, we write a report, we send them the report, we go through the report with a risk representative, and then maybe at some point a few months later they fix something. And this is the approach that I call, like Hank Hill, I sell pen tests and pen test accessories. It's a very traditional approach. And for those big projects, it works. But there's also a part of the bank that's a software company that's shipping code every 6 weeks, shipping code every week. And this sort of approach doesn't scale. We need to be in there integrated with the source analysis, doing SAST and DAST. We need to be in there doing software composition analysis. We need to be reviewing pull requests. We need to be doing tactile pen tests of small features as they're going live, and able to have feedback loops where instead of scheduling a meeting, writing a report, putting the report through a QA process, we can just sit down with the developer and go, let's code a patch. I'll review your pull request and approve the patch. So that's something where I think Agile works over Waterfall. The final dichotomy that I wanted to examine here in managing a team is technical excellence versus business imperative. And this, in some way, leans back to the original one about people's management styles. Either you've come from a technical background or you've come from a management background, but it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. You could have come from a technical background and become someone who manages more to business imperative, or vice versa. And if you manage for technical excellence, you will have a lot of advantages. So if you look at a lot of the top tier consulting organizations that have a really good reputation, a lot of the big Silicon Valley companies, Googles and Facebooks and AWS, etc., they have this real reputation that they do security really well. They've got the best people. They've got all these famous people working there. You get to do really cool stuff. And that's attractive. It becomes self-catalytic. You attract the talent because people want to work in that kind of environment. It means that you avoid technical debt, and you, what I would say, accumulate technical capital, in the sense that you have tools and systems that you've built that enable you to then do more and more cool stuff. The downside is that it can really conflict with deadlines, and I'll get to an example of where this occurred for me and became a really serious problem. And there are times where often you just have to make a compromise and say, we need to ship this product. We've got a deadline and we have to ship the code, even if there might be a security vulnerability in it. That's the business imperative. So that, if you manage the business imperative, then you will be able to do what's pragmatic, meet those deadlines, get the code out with a managed approach to the risk of any vulnerabilities. This will generally have better financial outcomes, et cetera, for the company. But it also has this negative self-catalytic function where you have a poor reputation for security, you accumulate technical debt, now nobody wants to work there, so you get people who aren't very good working there who make the whole situation worse. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And I'm sure that we can all think of consulting organizations that I won't publicly slander that have this sort of reputation where they don't do the best job, they don't attract the best people, and it's just a vicious cycle. The one where this really came to the fore for me was again at Console Connect. And it was even beyond the technical challenges that we were facing building the network, building the physical network infrastructure. There were solutions that we could put in place that were pragmatic and would work. One of the problems that we had was the architect of the whole system, who was on my team, this was his grand vision. This was his, he's a fantastic software engineer, one of the best in the world. And he came into it saying, I've got a greenfield project. I'm going to architect this. I'm going to do everything right. Everything will be correct. No code will flow into production unless it's through a CI/CD pipeline. Everything will be automated. Everything will be serverless infrastructure. Everything will be immutable. He had all of these design principles and declarations of what would and wouldn't happen. And it was a fantastic design. But the problem was the venture capitalists were constantly pushing us to ship features, saying, if you don't ship this feature, we're not giving you the next round of funding, and then you're all out of a job. So this caused a huge contention between the architect, who was trying to do the technically correct thing, and everybody else really who was trying to just get the product out the door so that we could meet the requirements of the venture capitalists. And again, caused friction. In this case, I'd say it was actually a healthy friction, because in the end, they built something that was well architected, that did get out on time, and they sold it for a boatload of cash to PCCW. So well done. So to summarize all of this stuff, I think you can look at these things in two dimensions. I don't know if anyone's ever done one of those vote compass things where it puts your political views in two dimensions. One of them's about sort of economic control versus economic freedom, and the other one's about social control versus social freedom. And so I would say that you could put management into these axes as well and say you either err towards the side of what the business needs, or you err towards the side of technical excellence, and you can err towards the side of control, things like being in an office or being a micromanager, versus hands-off, having a remote team that you give a lot of autonomy to. And as I've put here with all of these statements, they all have potentially negative outcomes, right? If you can't guess, I'm in the bottom right here. I've literally told people on my team to drop exploits on full disclosure. And I probably learned from that. I probably wouldn't anymore. So yeah, I think that's a way of thinking about these things. And just like the vote compass stuff, there's no right and wrong. Everybody's got an opinion, and there are good leaders who fall in different places in the spectrum. If you look at somebody like a Steve Jobs, he'd be way up in the top right? He's a control freak, highly technical, but he did a really good job. And I couldn't stand to work with Steve Jobs, but he did fantastic. He probably couldn't stand to work with me either. Again, that you'd have somebody like our friend at Console who would probably be a little bit more in the middle, in between business and technical, but very high on control. And him and I had quite a lot of friction. But he's a very successful manager, has led really successful teams. So there's no right and wrong. But I think the important thing is to match this with the team and to have some consistency within the organization. This is my last slide. So different people work better under different structures. Like I said, there are people who like to be micromanaged. They like to have certainty about what they're doing and clarity about their day and the systems and know that they're following the process. And there are people who can't stand it. They just want autonomy and management, leave me alone. So I think the best way is to be true to your own style as a leader, find out what that style is, be true to it, and then attract and retain people who gel with that and create structures and processes that support that. So if you create a process or a structure where the best way to have a team meeting is at the coffee shop, fine. If the best way to have it is an IRC at 11 p.m. because that's the best for everybody's time zone, that can work as well. I've seen both of those work, but I think they need to be consistent. If you have highly divergent structures within one organization or teams that interact closely, it will tend to cause friction. So I think that's pretty good for time. I will stop there and see if we have any questions. How many table flips does it take to be a successful manager? Nice one. Haven't actually flipped any personally. I've threatened to. I've seen people threaten to, but never actually done it. Thank you, everybody, for the positive feedback. I appreciate it very much. If we have no questions, I think we're on time. So enjoy the rest of the conference and hope to see you all in the flesh soon. Oh, and the next TusCon will be in 2021, May 21. Thanks, everyone.